Welcome to the Digital Government Podcast. Tune in to discover the future of governance and ways of getting there.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Digital Government Podcast of eGovernance Academy. This is your usual host, Federico Plantera. I'm a journalist, a sociologist, and researcher, and in this episode, we're going to talk about unlocking the potential of artificial intelligence, a deep dive. We talk about the impact on people, economy, and security, and we do that with Lukas Ilves, who's the former CIO of the government of Estonia and currently advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine in terms of digital transformation. So, Lukas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back.
Today, on the topic of AI, I would like to introduce you also with a sentence that I remember that I noted down at the last e-governance conference that we had back in May 2024. And it is, you said that basically with artificial intelligence, we are entering an entirely new era of computing, no?
So first of all, yes, I absolutely stand by that sentence. The analogy is to the internet plus the PC in the 1990s. And what that means, of course, is it's not that AI is new. Well, the term is from the 1950s, but we've reached a point where the degree of adoption, the expense or their lack thereof, ultimately thanks to the progression of Moore's law, and the capabilities have gotten to the point where it's really starting to have an impact and is going to change society. And there is now a whole set of capacities that AI, especially generative AI, brings to the table that we have not previously been able to put into in the form of computers and machines, and that is going to change a lot. Now, the tricky bit here is we have a good sense of what AI is going to be able to do, can do now, and how that might progress to a point for the next few years, but a much less clear sense of how quickly that's going to happen. There's a huge amount of uncertainty over, we're starting to learn right now exactly how and when you can actually use these tools to supplement or replace people. We're learning a lot about the cost and the implementation difficulties. I'd say we're in a learning phase. There are a couple of places where some real transformations happened, but by and large, it's still experimentation in early days. Now, the big domain, of course, where we've gone from experimentation to fundamental transformation is in warfare, and it's very specifically, of course, in Ukraine and the bordering parts of Russia. So in that war, where we have seen, I think, a change in the nature of warfare, at least as fundamental as the introduction of the tank at the end of World War II. And of course, that's driven by necessity. It's driven by brutal land war that we haven't seen in Europe since 1945. And unfortunately, it's driven by the capability of two sides. I mean, we like to, we all like to sort of feel good about Ukraine's innovation and root for Ukraine, but let's not look past the fact that the second best participant in this conflict, or the second most capable, I should say, is Russia. And they have gone through 2.5 years of brutal learning and iteration and have gotten much better at building and deploying a lot of these tools. So drones, but it's not just the drones and the robotics. It's also the use of AI for everything from artillery targeting to logistics to how you organize a lot of your operations. Of course, governments at war are very different to governments not at war. And that's true, first of all, in militaries. And so if we talk about, AI in militaries elsewhere, we should also be a little bit more specific. Governments have been using AI for decades and decades. So let's agree that when we say AI in something, what we're really talking about is generative AI and some of the other things that have happened in the last couple of years. Most other governments are using or experimenting with the technology, but have definitely not gotten to the point, even in their militaries, where it has begun to change how they do things. And of course, in the military context, that's a worry, because it's not just for Estonia and for NATO a question of having the tools, the drones, the tech. It's also having the doctrines and the planning that support all of that. And outside of that, I think that when it comes to generative AI, I haven't seen big transformations yet. And to be very honest, we haven't seen the big transformations anywhere. We haven't seen the big, including outside of government. We haven't seen it yet in the way we're working. It's really early days. we're starting to see the data on how individual people using generative AI have a lot more capability.
There is, in any case, experimentation that is happening in two different domains and levels, I think. One is the individual level. I feel that people in general are starting to actually go to, I will just make as an example, ChatGPT and just test out what it can do, putting in a prompt and seeing what's up with it. That's already like experimentation in any case with technology. But very interesting, the other point that you were making about how maybe could we say that we have seen most of the implementation and testing of AI actually in the defense sectors in general?
And that's true for some of the use cases. I think certainly if we're talking about robotics, if we're talking about autonomy, then yes, for obvious reasons, because it's not a question of making something 10 or 20% cheaper. It's about having a capability that you otherwise couldn't have at any price. If we're talking more broadly, though, I'm not sure that generalization holds. So we're seeing a lot more than experimentation if we look at how people are using generative AI. More than half of large enterprises in the US are using generative AI in their software development process. So it's being built into the workflows of a lot of people. Lots and lots of chatbots being put out there. So far, the reason it's not transformational is it hasn't changed how those businesses fundamentally work. They've put it into existing functions to make it more effective. Individuals, I think, again, are doing more than playing with it. We go to a school today, and you'll see a very large portion of students using generative AI in their writing. Hopefully not to completely replace their own writing, but to supplement
Hopefully.
it. And I'll speak to my own experience. I've been partially, working as a researcher now again this past year, and there are two things. Well, there are three things I use it for. One is I use it for writing and for ideation, as many people do, and it's a great partner because you can get analysis of a huge amount of information. You can pull on that, late hours of the night when you wouldn't necessarily call up someone to have a chat about something. But there are also two capabilities that I've been using that I wouldn't use if I didn't have generative AI. They're skills that I have in principle, but I don't access those skills a lot, and they're hard for me to deploy. The first of those is data analysis. I've learned how to use data in university, how to use statistical packages, but if you're not a data scientist every day, it takes a while to restart that capability, and you only use that when you really need an answer, because it takes time, even if you're an expert, to set up a data set in a statistical package.
Yep.
And now I just take the data set, throw it into ChatGPT, and I can get the answers in 5 minutes. And so the sort of personal time economics of working with data have changed for me. And the other is very simple coding. Again, I know how to code. I haven't done it in years. I was working on a project and I wanted to scrape some websites to get some data. The scraping tool that I had wasn't working very well. ChatGPT wrote a script in a few minutes and told me exactly how to deploy it. So what we're seeing on an individual level, and this is when we hear that ChatGPT raises the capabilities of, in particular of those who are at the lower end of a skill spectrum, I think what we immediately hear is, okay, the less competent people get better. But it's true, but it's not less competent people. It's individuals who add a specific function are less competent. So you can see it also has a democratizing function. It means that coding skills, design skills suddenly become much more easily available to a much broader part or segment of people. So we know this is happening individually. It just takes time for teams and then for organizations to start doing that collectively. And of course, when you do these things, when you build it into your workflow, there are related engineering challenges. Like when I'm just using it myself, there's all sorts of data pipeline questions or interoperability questions that I don't have to solve that you do have to solve for a team. So it takes time, but I don't think there's a lot of sort of engineering around these tools that we're talking months, not years, and now we're starting to see products that are focused on specific use cases coming out. So I think we're going to continue to be amazed by how AI gets used, because even if we stopped all of the technological development of the LLMs, just deploying the capability we have now and letting that play through the economy is going to have a huge impact.
Because reshifting the level, let's say, of analysis, like from individuals to governments, do you think, considering that we have already mentioned some countries, let's say, we could mention even more that are testing or have already been using AI, let's say, in their service provision, for example, for some time. One of the maybe most prominent examples in that sense, both in terms of opportunities and risk, is probably the Dutch government that is doing a lot in that sense. But that's just one. Mm-hmm. So my question to you would be, do you think that there are specific maybe countries, regions, or even, let's say, government services specifically that you believe are kind of like setting standards in terms of artificial intelligence adoption for the public benefit, for the public good?
I don't know if it's possible to say setting standards yet, but we can do a quick tour of the world, right? China, of course, is doing a whole lot. We don't exactly know what they're doing. We may not want to buy into some of the political values behind it, but we shouldn't ever forget that in a good mapping. The other big sort of thing that for me is an interesting question mark is the US, who, on a case-by-case basis have always been a leader of AI in government. It's just never been at the level of broad horizontal platforms, and they have other problems. But if a small portion of the ambition that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy have sort of put out for Doge and how they want to change government processes does occur, we'll see a lot in the US. And I think it's interesting for governments that are coming from behind, because generative AI can help with some of the challenges they face. So for instance, in the US context, you have a huge data quality problem. And I'm not going to naively say generative AI solves all your data quality problems, but it actually makes some of the challenges easier. And it makes the importance of Estonia, what Estonia has done around sort of very methodically and rigorously dealing with data quality and semantics and formats, not irrelevant, but less important. It's all a question of degree, and we'll see how that works sort of when applied in the field. Within Europe, there's a couple of countries that are doing more in Europe. You mentioned the Netherlands, Estonia, Finland. There, you hear a lot about what's going on in the Gulf states. It's, we'll see how much of that turns into transformation. And then I think we should also be, the last place I'd look to be surprised is Africa. And the reason, of course, is that a lot of countries in Africa are now in the same situation that Estonia was in 30 years ago, which is to say that they are really starting, in a sense, from a blank sheet. And some of the sort of faster moving countries are doing stuff that in terms of quality and maturity is comparable to where we are. But they don't have the organizational legacy. They don't have some of the legal legacy, and so they might be able to move faster. So I would look in particular to places like Ghana and Rwanda to see maybe very interesting developments.
Okay, but then if in the same way as we spoke about individuals, then there are governments and countries that are ready, let's say, in different ways and to different extents to take on artificial intelligence and like to implement artificial intelligence, then I definitely think that we could maybe look at artificial intelligence in government as a bit of a tide that lifts all boats, but it obviously does not do that equally, in the sense that there are some characteristics, I believe, like in the case of people, and then maybe in the case of governments we could call enablers, that do set countries apart from each other in terms of how ready they are, in terms of like adopting AI, and also in what way they're doing it, for what, in what domains, and to what extent. Do you think that there are some maybe like digital and cultural elements that do set countries apart in this sense, in terms of culture of organization, obviously?
And it's not, of course there are. I think that on the cultural and the organizational side, it's going to be the exact same factors that have affected quality of digital transformation. So it's going to be, first of all, how flexible and how iterative are your organizations? What's your risk tolerance? But also more nuts and bolts things like, can you adjust your funding cycles to dealing with subscriptions? How do you deal with new infrastructure? How do you skill people? So as a general prediction, and this is not just true for governments, I think it's true for organizations, the organizational capacities that have made you good at digital transformation will also be what makes you good at AI. And there are also technical aspects of digital government that are still very, very relevant. So I'll contradict my point earlier on data quality. Of course, Gen AI helps and it solves some problems, but fundamentally, having data, having it governed, having it be accessible and usable, having the interfaces to do automation, because of course what generative AI now allows you to do, the sort of take parts of processes that previously required human intervention or that required human checking and automate those too. But then the question is, what does that connect to? And so you have the pipeline to automate things. So a country like Exro that already has a lot of automation, that already can do automated services, can now plug the generative AI in and sort of fill in more of the gaps where you still kind of slowed processes down and to have things be, end-to-end more automated. So as a general prediction, countries and organizations that are good at digital transformation will be good at Gen AI. But we will see exceptions. And part of that, we'll see exceptions and we'll also see surprises. Because, of course, a lot of what's being good on the organizational level is a combination of a sense of urgency, a certain culture. And there will be countries that lack that, but where generative AI and the capabilities become the trigger for them to go and do something. And there will also be countries that have been slow on digital transformation that are slow on Gen AI. So I would call it a tide that lifts all boats. I actually think we'll see more of a divergence between the organizations that get it and those that don't. I mean, just to come back to the last decade of digital transformation, the gap between understanding the potential and acting on it has always been big. And I think we'll see that too. And increasing, it was the same thing with Gen AI, maybe with the caveat that in some cases the capabilities will be so big, the contrast will be so big that if you sort of don't do it, like you won't be allowed to stay around very long. Either you'll get eaten out of the market, or if you're in government, someone will come and say, well, why aren't you doing this? So that's kind of maybe a hope that the pressures become stronger.
I will bring the topic of data management and data quality into the next question, which is actually about maybe something that pertains a little bit as well to perhaps more of a human component of implementing AI and artificial intelligence. What do I mean by that? There are many governments that, in any case, do face setbacks already, even in this experimentation phase, let's say. What would you say that are some of the most common challenges, let's say, that you have observed in terms of implementing artificial intelligence so far? But also, I would then slightly twist this question to ask you, what are then people doing with AI at this point, at the government level?
Yeah. As a broad categorization, we can say there's two sort of forms of using it. One is generically the same thing that largish organizations are doing everywhere. And then there's going to be the government-specific things. So if we're talking about what large organizations do, chatbots for any kind of sort of user-facing interaction, and then a lot of internal stuff. So, you think about all the sort of functions of just doing things, preparing documents and memos, internal communications, and we see a lot of experimenting there, where the basic output is greater efficiency, greater effectiveness, and sometimes also doing things like catching errors. And I think here, the best governments will not be the fastest movers among all organizations, but they'll be able to copy sort of what's being done in the private sector and the tooling pretty quickly. So I think we are going to see chatbots getting better and better. One of the unsolved questions in chatbots is going from the conversational interaction to the kind of deterministic, okay, you actually change a legal status or we do something based on the interaction. That's hard everywhere. It's especially hard for governments where that has a legal status. But I think there's some workarounds where, you have a conversation and then you still press a button to sort of accept. And we see some in Estonia. We have memos being prepared with Gen AI. We have procurements being prepared. We have lawmakers using it to kind of brainstorm new legislation, kind of government as an organization. Where we're seeing less so far, but I think what is ultimately more interesting is when Gen AI starts playing a role in government-specific functions. So first of all, when we talk about user interaction and how the user actually consumes the service, when we get to the point of agents, where we really have agents that can act on behalf of individuals in a somewhat autonomous way, which maybe that will happen in the next year or two. That's what the industry is promising. That will present government with a situation where their user that's interacting with their system is no longer a live human being. And that can be very cool in terms of service design, because it solves a lot of the cost and complexity around designing new services. It's also a whole new governance problem, because what happens if some people have more capable agents that use more services than others? And a lot of governance around the trust-related questions, because if I'm using an agent provided by Apple or Google to interface with my public services, the legal obligation, the framework is about what the state provides me as a person. How does that all fit together? The second is using AI agents for public functions. We're seeing less of that in government so far than in the private sector, in part because some of those public functions are legally defined. So things like procurement or hiring, it's harder to sort of, you have strict legal frameworks that you're in government that you're not in the private sector. But it's also really exciting because if we think, for example, why is it that government procurement has a lot of rules and is frustrating? Or government hiring has a lot of rules and it's frustrating. Those rules exist for a reason. They exist to prevent favoritism. They exist to ensure procedural fairness and various other goals, requirements like transparency that a government might have. These are goals we can embed into the agent. So, if you have an AI agent doing your procurement, you can't bribe it, that's clear, but you can also sort of make sure that it follows equal treatment and other things in what it's doing, but then it can do some of the interactions that we have not allowed humans to do. So anyone who knows public procurement knows it's frustrating compared to procurement in the private sector because I can't negotiate with my suppliers. I can't say, well, you give me some price off, you do it faster, well, I'll agree with you. And there's good reasons for that because that becomes a place that you can hide the favoritism in, that you can hide the corruption in. But if I have an AI agent doing it, maybe I can let it negotiate in a much harder and different way that any procurement or auction process lets me do, and I can actually solve the problem of public procurement being really messy and frustrating. Similar things with hiring and firing, and using the AI agents to go and, say, scour my data and look for unethical behavior, look for corrupt behavior. So I think we're at the cusp of where the AI agents and the technology, at least in theory, allow us to do things differently in how we do public functions. So it's not just sort of speeding it up or making it more efficient, but changing the nature of the function. I say the technology allows it because there is inevitably for these things going to be a gap where for these things there will be more testing, there will be more questioning as to whether we can rely on it because we're talking about processes where we're taking a human out of the loop in some fundamental ways. Maybe not something that put lives in danger, but if I do the procurement with AI, I'm taking the human out of the loop of the procurement process. But I think that's interesting. And then the last bit, this will take some years again, is changing the regulatory function of the state. Changing how compliance works. Letting AI agents go and sit in the information systems of a factory or an or a farm and check, are they meeting safety requirements? Are they meeting environmental requirements based in real time on their data without having to give government access to all that data, just spitting out the yes, they're compliant, no, they're not compliant. And then you can start thinking of a very, much more interesting, more flexible regulatory system. But this is the stuff we're not seeing yet. This is the stuff that we should be talking about because we might want to start getting ready for it. We might want to start experimenting, but this will take longer to do.
I would say, though, that you just said in your last sentence, this is the stuff that we're not seeing. But I would say that many people would also say that if there is, for example, like an AI agent or like an AI tool regulating or like not orchestrating, but in any case, like leading, let's say, the process maybe of like a hiring and firing or the public tender and procurements and stuff, then I would say that there are many people who would also answer to that as well, if it's AI doing it, we're even less seeing it because we're not seeing into the algorithm, we're not seeing into artificial intelligence, we're basically looking at a field and at a domain that is highly specialized and specialistic in a way as well. And I think that is, for example, one of the challenges that are brought to the implementation of artificial intelligence by people, observers, researchers, analysts, consultants, when it comes to implementing AI in the government sector, in the public sector. I would mention on this, for example, not to dunk on the Dutch, but that there is that, for example, there are some famous cases, let's say, of, or also like on the Spanish government with the algorithm to protect women from domestic violence and to prevent basically cases of domestic violence. Algorithms that in the Dutch cases, in the Spanish case, have been challenged in the sense like a practical use of artificial intelligence that has been challenged. This is one of the objections, if we want, that are often, let's say, brought to artificial intelligence and the use of artificial intelligence in government or on people, let's say, because the process of hiring and firing is also like on people. In this sense, what do you think that are then some of these most common challenges that are brought to the implementation of artificial intelligence. And at the same time, that obviously takes us to talk about the risks.
Yeah.
What are those that you see from your own perspective?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, both explainability and transparency, super critical. And not just in government, it's one of the toughest challenges in general for Gen AI. What we know about this is that we don't know the answer fully yet, but what we know a little bit about what the answer is going to look like. And it's basically going to be other AIs. So, I mean, the way you can control an AI and understand what it's doing is to basically have something else working at the same scale, at the same speed, interacting with it. So if I really want to understand, I mean, if I have a black box, and I don't fully agree with the characterization of AIs as black boxes, but for the sake of argument, I have a black box. And I can't look inside it. How do I understand how it works? Well, I test it with many different inputs, many different circumstances, and I develop a model of how it works from that interaction. And so, I mean, that's one of the ways that we're going to have to change the way in which we think of sort of whether a process is fair, whether it's appropriate or not, which is that we can test it. I mean, it's a question of what we have to do, but it's what we can do. Because with a manual process or human process, you can't run a billion simulations. Well, I can take an AI model and I can put it through a billion scenarios and then take the output data and understand how it behaves and then make an assessment based on that. And that of course, that means accepting that the sort of the terrain on which we assess sort of fairness or other outputs of an AI is going to look different, but it's a different way of doing things. And beyond that, there are a couple of thoughts that come to mind on how we deal with the sort of the challenges that are also government specific. So the first thing is, in this phase of learning, you want to avoid the kind of government steamroller effect that you put something to AI or an algorithm and it's decided and now that's the only choice, right? Because that's when you have all of these miscarriages of justice. It's someone's had a great idea, okay, we could use an algorithm, there's a lot of benefits to it, they start doing it, and then bad things start happening. The question really is, what do you do when those bad things start happening? So for me, the sort of good negative use case, the UK, this is not AI per se, but the UK some years ago put in place an algorithm to prioritize their organ donor recipients. And fundamentally, it's all what we've done. We've asked, questions about, well, what's the likelihood they live? What's the impact? They put that algorithm to a machine. They made a very basic problem in the math of the algorithm. The idea is it calculates what's the expected net increase in lifespan from receiving the transplant. Then the idea being that you sort people based on that. But they only asked that over a 5-year window. The result of which is that healthy old people with a high likelihood of success were ranked highest, and somewhat less likely to be successful young people were ranked lower. A problem there, leaving aside the ethical question of what's the right basic framework, let's assume that you're going to optimize on expected net gain lifespan. The healthy young person, the less healthy young person, they may be a lower probability, but that gain can be 30, 40, 50 years of lifespan. But the way the algorithm calculated only calculated 5 years. And so the impact was that just no young people basically got these organ transplants. So also because if you're a young person needing an organ transplant, it's probably it's a trickier case. It's not just that the organ has gotten old and you have other problems most likely. So, but the real problem was not that the algorithm did this. It's that they just used this for 6 years. They didn't change it. There were people who complained. They just blindly went forward with it. Because you could have come up with this crappy algorithm, and people actually said this in the design phase, and realized quickly, oh, wait, we made a mistake, and then let's optimize and let's go through this and let's have this discussion. And so that's what you have to be doing. You have to have a feedback mechanism that very quickly detects these errors, not just on a technical level, but on an organizational level. And that's, yes, it's a specific design process for any given question. It's also a bit of a cultural question of, what do you do when a citizen writes you and says, well, this is not right, or I'm having this weird thing. And the countries and the societies and the specific use cases where they get that right, they're going to catch the errors, they're going to catch the things that we would say are AI not malfunctioning much faster. The other bit the other bit I'd also add to this is it does matter what the disparate impact is. And one reason, I think Estonians are often fairly open to using things is that the disparate impact of government behavior is lower. We have we have a legal system that's very good at sort of ensuring the rights of the accused. We don't, throw people in jail for a very long, sort of long durations of time. So I mentioned that kind of as a contrast, like when you talk about algorithmic stuff in the US in law enforcement, the background context is that you have a law enforcement and incarceration system that's much harsher. So the cost of an error in the US is much higher than the cost of an error in Estonia.
But then, in that sense, and two things before we go. One would be, what are, in your opinion, then the practical steps, let's say, that governments should take in order to prepare for a broader AI integration in governments? Is it talent acquisition? Is it maybe legal frameworks? Is it infrastructure? What do you think are those things? What is the grocery list, let's say?
If I could pick two things, look, the first is we've talked about obstacles or stumbling blocks, but the reality is that 90% of the time, the biggest obstacle in the stumbling block is that the fear of the obstacles and the stumbling blocks gets in the way, which is to say, it's all the compliance people, all the lawyers explaining why you shouldn't do it or what the risks are. So being really, I'm not saying don't think about the risk, but sort of the phenomenon you see is that people are conservative. If there's a potential risk or a potential non-compliance, they'll err on the side of not taking the risk. And one thing you can have there is you can have people that really understand the applicable legislation. So Europe, especially data protection, now the AI Act, because if you don't understand the legislation, your immediate rational behavior, especially in government, is not to take the risk. And, the AI Act, and GDPR, they were written and designed in order for people to do data processing, in order for people to use AI. Their goal is not, let's not process data, let's not use AI. So they both have well thought through systems to allow you to do it subject to constraints and ethics and right behavior. But if you just view it as a break or a reason not to do it, which you do if you don't know the legislation, you don't get that far. So having like the lawyer in government whose job it is not to say no, but to say yes and here's why and how you can do it as an enabler. And the other thing that's really important is using the tooling and everything that's coming out of the private sector. And this is not a new challenge for government. We're familiar with all the difficulty that government has had using cloud. And that's itself, it's a whole bundle of issues. It's a skills question, it's a procurement question, it's a compliance and all these things. But what we're going to see is that if you can consume the services, they're going to be provided as cloud services primarily, that are really quickly being developed, you're going to move much faster. And this isn't just a question of like foundational models and GPT. It's going to be all the more specific applications, and that's where a lot of the sort of creativity is now happening. Is okay, I have this raw capability in an LLM. How do I fit it into a workflow? There are going to be products that do that. There will also be consultancies that come and solve specific problems. And so there, it's the same thing of, the porous openness, bringing people in, bringing consultancies, maybe it's coming and having a Palantir or a KPMG do something. Maybe it's having a startup that can work really closely with an agency. But all these things around how you do the collaboration, use private sector services, those that can solve that or not let that get in the way, they'll move faster because you don't want to reinvent the wheel that is spinning very quickly.
Lucas, with this topic and the closing, let's say, remarks and questions, I will actually take the chance to introduce the topic of the upcoming e-governance conference 2025, which is going to be titled From Bytes to Benefits, Raising Prosperity Through Digital Transformation, because we're actually having a focus this time on the tangible impact, the tangible effects of digital transformation on the economy and society. We already today with this conversation have painted quite a picture, like not just of the present, but also like of applications for the future and definitely what's coming up or what should be coming up. A closing question to you then for this episode is, how do you see then, if you were to fast forward for a moment to, I don't know, let's say 5 years in time, let's say 2030, how do you see artificial intelligence tangibly influencing the economy and society through government? So we're not talking here about like private organizations, even though we did say that governments are going to take a lot, let's say, from the way that private organizations will be dealing with AI and are already dealing with artificial intelligence in their processes. But through government, on the economy and society, what's gonna be happening in your opinion?
How won't it, right? In a sense, it's going to touch everything. It's tough to hit a good generalization that kind of encapsulates it. But I think, look, it's a lot of the things that we've talked about digital transformation doing, better data, data-driven decision-making, automation, like we've actually not delivered on that yet. Even in a place like Estonia, we're scratching the surface. So a lot of what Gen AI will first do is it'll let us actually deliver those things that we've talked about for a while. That's one thing. And I think what I hope for is beyond that two things. First of all, that sort of the idea that we've talked again a lot about the state being more personalized, really coming and fitting around each unique case, that can start happening. Because sort of all of the scalability problems around well, you can solve a hard problem a lot better if you have a lot of intelligences working on it. And you have so many of the failures in service provision that we hear about. It's ultimately because the service didn't have time to think about this unique case. The tragic family sort of abuse situation, the safety issue that didn't get addressed, and so having more intelligences attacking those problems will just make us better at them. In every aspect of the sort of the services, the social goods provision, so on of the state. And the other thing is that I want the regulatory state to get better, because regulations exist to provide public goods and to prevent harms, particularly in areas where the costs and the harms are not internalized, or it's hard to capture the value. So that's why we have safety regulation, right? Because it's cheaper not to follow the rules, but we don't have the rules because we want rules. We have the rules because we don't want accidents to happen. And so what I would really look forward to is a world in which a lot of the regulatory functions of government that exist for the right reason, they become much less burdensome and much more about the outcome and much less about the rules. I don't want to say with certainty that we'll be there in 2030, but I think there will be domains where it's easier to sort of apply that and things are straightforward where we are. And we'll have in 2030 a very clear map of where things go. But I have to close with this. Nobody knows. It may be that we're nowhere near there, and maybe by 2030 we have artificial superintelligence and we've all been turned into paper clips. So especially any prediction that has a time value attached to it is very tough. And it's always good to remember a statement, I'm forgetting who originated this, but that sort of in the time frame of a couple of years, much less will happen than you think, and in the time frame of a decade, much more will happen than you think.
But I would say that that's advice and a scope, let's say, or a vision that counts also for us individually and not just governments when making plans and looking into the future. And Luca Silves, thanks a lot for joining us today in this episode.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
And it was a pleasure also for us to introduce the topic of the upcoming e-governance conference 2025. As I said, the title is going to be From Bites to Benefits, Raising Prosperity Through Digital Transformation. So basically the impact, tangible, effective, of digital transformation on the economy and society. Some of you listeners will probably have received already the invitation email. And for all the rest, there's obviously the website. And the conference is going to take place in May 28th, 29th in Tallinn. Thanks a lot, everybody, for tuning into this podcast episode. And that's it also from your usual host.
This podcast is brought to you by the eGovernance Academy. Tune in next time.